How 80,000 Crusaders destroyed 150,000 Ottomans. The Battle of Vienna. How could a smaller Crusader force, just 80,000 strong, bring down an Ottoman army nearly twice its size outside Vienna in 1683? Was it a matter of numbers, or did technology, tactics, leadership, and morale play a bigger role? Why do historians remember this clash not just as a battle, but as one of the turning points in European history? And when people say the Crusaders destroyed the Ottomans that day, are they speaking literally, or is it an exaggeration shaped by legend? These are the questions at the heart of the story of the Battle of Vienna. Hello, we are Great History, your daily history channel, bringing you 30 minutes of history every day. If you want to shape what comes next on this channel, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 55,000 subscribers. When you look at the map of Europe in the late 17th century, Vienna was the gateway between East and West. Geographically, it sat on the Danube River, a major artery that connected the Balkans with Central Europe. Whoever held Vienna controlled the highway into the heart of Europe. For the Ottomans, who had been steadily pushing north and west since the 14th century, Vienna was more than just a prize. It was the key to unlocking Germany, and beyond that, possibly even Italy. The Ottomans had tried this before. Back in 1529, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, they laid siege to Vienna but failed, mostly due to bad weather and stretched supply lines. But by 1683, they believed the time was right for another attempt. Europe was fractured by internal disputes, and the Ottoman leadership thought a decisive blow could finish what Suleiman had started 150 years earlier. By the time Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led the Ottoman army toward Vienna in 1683, the empire was still one of the world's most powerful states. It stretched from North Africa to the Middle East, covering roughly 3.5 million square kilometers. But beneath the surface, cracks were showing. The Ottomans had faced military setbacks in the Mediterranean against the Spanish and Venetians, and they were under pressure from the Persians in the east. Still, they had the resources to mobilize a massive force. Contemporary estimates put Kara Mustafa's army at around 150,000 men, though some modern historians suggest the true number was between 120,000 and 140,000. This force included elite janissaries, cavalry known as sipahis, artillery units, and allies such as Crimean Tatars. Kara Mustafa himself was ambitious, some would say overly so. He dreamed not just of taking Vienna, but of making it a jewel of the Ottoman Empire. Unlike Suleiman in 1529, who had been content to batter the walls into rubble, Kara Mustafa wanted to take Vienna intact, preserving its wealth and beauty. This choice, to avoid a full-scale bombardment, would prove to be one of his fatal mistakes. So how did the Ottomans march all the way to Vienna? The story begins in the Balkans, territories already under Ottoman control. From there, Kara Mustafa launched his campaign in the spring of 1683. By July, his forces had crossed into Habsburg lands and surrounded Vienna with a massive camp. The city had a population of about 15,000 soldiers and civilians, backed by roughly 11,000 troops under Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. In other words, Vienna was outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. While the Ottomans advanced, Europe was far from united. The Habsburg monarchy, which ruled Austria, was fighting almost alone at first. Emperor Leopold I actually fled Vienna with his court, retreating to Linz and later Passau. The German princes were divided. Some feared the Ottomans, others feared giving the emperor too much power if Vienna was saved. The Papal States, led by Pope Innocent XI, saw the crisis as a religious showdown. For him, this wasn't just politics. It was Christianity versus Islam, and the survival of Catholic Europe was at stake. The Pope poured money into organizing what became known as the Holy League, a coalition of Catholic states willing to fight the Ottomans. One of the most important players in this alliance was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland itself was in decline, torn by internal conflicts and foreign invasions, but its king, Jan III Sobieski, was an experienced general. The Pope's emissaries convinced Sobieski to commit his forces, and in August 1683, he began marching with about 27,000 Polish troops, including his famous winged hussars. Religion played a powerful role in rallying the defenders. Pope Innocent XI framed the entire war as a crusade, and the soldiers of the coalition were blessed as if they were medieval crusaders marching under the cross. Sobieski himself was deeply religious. Before leading the decisive charge at Vienna, he is said to have prayed with his troops. On the Ottoman side, the war was framed as a jihad, a holy war to expand the realm of Islam. Kara Mustafa carried with him the banner of the Prophet Muhammad, which had been given to the sultans as a symbol of divine legitimacy. For both sides, this was more than just a military conflict. It was seen as a clash of civilizations and faiths. The timing was also shaped by Ottoman ambition and European weakness. The Habsburgs were tied up fighting in Hungary. The Poles were distracted by conflicts with the Cossacks and the Swedes, and the German princes were bickering over power. Kara Mustafa saw an opportunity to strike when Europe was divided, hoping to score a victory that would rival Suleiman's glory days. The Ottomans marched into Central Europe with an army that was estimated at around 150,000 men. Normally, if you've got nearly double the manpower, the odds are in your favor. But as with so many turning points in history, the outcome wasn't just about headcounts. It was about how those men were organized, how they were supplied, who was leading them, and what was driving them forward. The Ottomans' force was massive, and it wasn't just one kind of soldier. They had the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that had been the backbone of the Ottoman military machine for centuries. By 1683, they were still feared, but their discipline wasn't quite what it had been 100 years earlier. Alongside them were the Sipahi, the Ottoman cavalry, who had traditionally been granted land in exchange for military service. Add to that the Crimean Tatars, mounted allies who specialized in fast raids and mobility, plus artillery units and engineers who brought along heavy siege equipment. This was a full-spectrum army, capable of surrounding and pounding a fortress like Vienna. The problem was, an army that big eats a lot. We're talking about feeding, watering, and supplying somewhere in the ballpark of 150,000 men, not to mention tens of thousands of horses. Historians like Andrew Wheatcroft point out that the Ottoman logistics system had to stretch all the way from the Balkans up to the outskirts of Vienna. That's hundreds of miles of wagons, oxen, and riverboats, just to keep food and ammunition flowing. By the late summer of 1683, those supply lines were under pressure. Foraging became harder as the land around Vienna had already been stripped bare, and moving grain or gunpowder from Hungary or the Balkans got slower and riskier as Christian raiding parties struck at convoys. Soldiers went hungry, fodder for horses ran short, and morale dropped. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa was in command of this Ottoman host. By all accounts, he was ambitious, some would say arrogant. He wanted Vienna not just as another conquest, but as a jewel that would prove his greatness. Instead of launching fast, decisive assaults, he preferred a long, grinding siege. That played into one of his army's strengths, because the Ottomans had some of the best siege engineers in the world. The siege began on July 14th, 1683. The method the Ottomans used was classic siege warfare of the 17th century. The Ottomans dug parallels zigzagging trenches that crept closer to the walls, while their gunners pounded the fortifications day and night. They tunneled under bastions, packed the tunnels with gunpowder, and blew sections of wall apart in carefully timed blasts. By late August, several outer bastions had been destroyed or badly damaged, and some of the defenders' outworks were literally collapsing into the craters left by mines. The pressure was relentless, and by early September, it looked like Vienna was hanging on by a thread. Inside the city, conditions were brutal. The defenders were led by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, who commanded only a few thousand effective troops at the start. Some counts say around 5,000 to 6,000 regular soldiers plus armed civilians and volunteers. That had to hold against an army more than 20 times their size. The defenders had some cannons of their own, and surprisingly, reports suggest they may have had more functioning artillery pieces than the Ottomans. But guns don't feed people. By September, bread and grain supplies had almost run out. Horses and livestock were slaughtered, and whatever else could be eaten was rationed. Refugees crammed into the city, adding to the strain. Disease spread in the cramped, unsanitary quarters. Typhus and dysentery took a toll on soldiers and civilians alike. Starhemberg tried to maintain discipline with harsh punishments, but morale was falling fast. People lived in constant fear, not only of hunger and sickness, but of what would happen if the Ottomans broke through the walls. Meanwhile, the Ottomans had their own problems. By late summer, Ottoman soldiers were also going hungry, and forage for horses was running out. An army that size eats through enormous resources. Modern historians estimate hundreds of tons of grain and fodder every week. The further the siege dragged on, the more shortages gnawed at the Ottoman camp. Desertion and sickness grew, and morale began to fray. Kara Mustafa's leadership decisions made all the difference here. He wanted Vienna intact, as a jewel to show off his victory. That meant he avoided all-out frontal assaults, which might have overwhelmed the defenders but would have left the city in ruins. Instead, he stuck with the slow, methodical siege. The problem with that approach is time. Every day he spent digging and bombarding was another day for the Christian powers to mobilize a relief army. In hindsight, many historians argue that Kara Mustafa's caution, his refusal to risk a messy storming of the city, was his biggest mistake. He may have thought he was being clever, but he gave his enemies exactly the time they needed. Daily life in Vienna during those 2 months became a nightmare of noise, fear, and deprivation. Eyewitnesses described constant cannon fire, nights lit by explosions from mines, and walls shaking under bombardment. Whole districts of houses were torn down by defenders to clear fields of fire. Families huddled in cellars to avoid collapsing walls. Children went hungry, disease claimed hundreds, and burial grounds overflowed. The fear of what would happen if the Ottomans got in, slaughter, slavery, or worse, hung over everyone. And yet, incredibly, the defenders held on just long enough. By early September, while Vienna's defenders were starving inside the walls, an Allied army with 10,000 men was on the move to break the siege. King Jan III Sobieski had just signed a treaty with the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I earlier that year, promising aid if Vienna was attacked. When the Ottoman siege began, Sobieski didn't wait. On the 15th of August, 1683, he left Krakow with his army. Mobilizing a large force wasn't simple. The Polish parliament, the Sejm, had been reluctant to fund the expedition, so Sobieski advanced much of the money himself. He hired wagons, secured provisions, and promised his men that imperial gold would eventually reimburse them. That financial gamble allowed him to move quickly. By covering hundreds of miles in just 3 weeks, His force managed to reach the Danube before the Ottomans could block the way. In military terms, that speed was almost reckless, but it gave the coalition its chance. The numbers tell the story of how wide this coalition stretched. By early September, about 80,000 men had been gathered. To picture that, imagine a city the size of modern-day Green Bay, Wisconsin, emptied out, armed, and marched into the hills above Vienna. The largest contingent was Polish, under King John Sobieski, who personally led about 20,000 troops, including 3,000 of his famous winged hussars. The Holy Roman Empire contributed roughly 30,000, drawn from Habsburg lands, while another 20,000 or so came from German principalities like Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia. Smaller states sent additional regiments, and the Pope's call for a Holy League gave the whole thing the flavor of a late crusade. If you've ever tried to get different groups to work together, you can imagine how messy this coalition could have been. Different languages, different commanders, different traditions. It wasn't an army that naturally fit together. But the situation was so desperate that unity was the only option. Sobieski was chosen as the overall commander, partly because of his reputation as a battlefield leader, partly because the Poles had marched the farthest and came ready for a fight. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, had fled Vienna earlier, leaving room for Sobieski to take charge without stepping on too many toes. The coalition's secret weapon was its heavy cavalry, and especially the Polish winged hussars. These men weren't just symbolic with their feathered wings. They were one of the most devastating shock forces of the 17th century. Clad in armor, armed with long lances, and mounted on powerful horses, they could smash through enemy lines in ways that lighter cavalry simply couldn't. At Vienna, their role would prove decisive. Now let's put the strengths and weaknesses side by side. The Ottomans had numbers, experience, and top-tier siege equipment. They had the city almost on its knees. Vienna was down to about 5,000 defenders inside the walls, and supplies were running out. But the Ottomans were far from home. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and Kara Mustafa's decision to wait and starve the city rather than take it by storm bought precious time for the Christian relief force to gather. Morale in the Ottoman camp was mixed. Some soldiers were frustrated by the lack of progress, while others worried about the growing threat to their rear. The Christians, meanwhile, were smaller in number, but had several big advantages. First, they were fighting on home ground, close to their supply bases. Second, their morale was high, fueled by the idea of defending Christendom against what was framed as an existential Ottoman threat. Third, they had unity of command under Sobieski, which meant they could move as one army rather than a patchwork. And finally, they had cavalry that could deliver the knockout blow once the moment was right. The Pope, Innocent XI, had sent subsidies to cover troop pay, while the Emperor scrounged up loans and grants. Without that funding network, it's unlikely all these groups would have marched together. Armies don't move just on bread and water. They move on coin, and coin kept this coalition in step. Getting to Vienna undetected was another hurdle. The Ottomans had scouts all over the region, but the Allies had one advantage: the Vienna woods, a thick belt of hills to the west of the city. Instead of taking the obvious open routes, the relief army went through those forests. Marching under heavy cover meant slower progress, especially for wagons and cannons. But it kept Ottoman lookouts from spotting the full force until it was too late. Local guides led columns along narrow tracks. Soldiers bivouacked in hidden glades at night. Fires were controlled or placed out of sight. From staging points like Tulln on the Danube, they threaded their way south and east, finally reaching the Kahlenberg Ridge, one of the hills overlooking Vienna. Terrain mattered a lot here. The Kallenberg and Leopoldsburg ridges stood above the plain where the Ottomans had pitched their camp. Imagine a massive tent city stretching along the Danube and the Wien River, packed with artillery, horse lines, and baggage trains. From the ridges, Allied commanders could literally look down into the enemy camp. The Ottomans had focused on the walls of Vienna and built their defenses facing the city. Their rear, facing the hills, was thinner. That geography gave the relief army a chance to set up an anvil and hammer strategy. Pin the Turks with infantry and guns in front, then sweep down with cavalry from above. Intelligence played its part too. Inside Vienna, messengers slipped through Ottoman lines to carry news. The most famous was Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, a Polish merchant who spoke Turkish and knew the terrain. Stories about him vary, but multiple accounts confirm he made dangerous runs through the siege lines, delivering word to the defenders and guiding information back to Sobieski's camp. Those reports told the Allies when the city was close to breaking and where Ottoman lines were weakest. Having that kind of human intelligence gave commanders the confidence to risk their massive flanking march. But a coalition of so many different armies can be a mess if not managed carefully. Who gives the orders? Who gets the glory? In this case, diplomacy ahead of time settled it. Sobieski would be the overall commander. Duke Charles of Lorraine, who had been leading the imperial forces in the field before the Poles arrived, agreed to coordinate under him. Each prince and duke still commanded their own men day to day, but they all signed on to a single battle plan. That plan was simple but effective. The Austrians and German contingents would press the Ottomans head-on, keeping them busy. Then Sobieski's Poles, with their heavy cavalry, would deliver the decisive strike from the flanks and ridges. It was a risky strategy, because if any part of the army broke early, the others might collapse. But everyone knew the Polish winged hussars were the coalition's best punch. September 11th, 1683 dawned hot and dry. In the forests west of Vienna, the Allied relief army marched out from the Vienna woods and climbed onto the ridges of Kallenberg and Leopoldsburg. From those heights, the soldiers looked down on the Ottoman lines that had strangled Vienna for 2 long months. Kara Mustafa, the Ottoman Grand Vizier, saw the enemy massing on the hills, but he underestimated how quickly they could descend into the plain. The Christian forces held religious services, prepared their artillery, and secured the slopes, while inside Vienna, the garrison braced for one more desperate night. The city was on the verge of collapse. On the morning of September 12, 1683, the Ottomans thought they had Vienna where they wanted it. Their grand army had been sitting outside the city since July. They had Janissaries, the once elite infantry corps, Sipahi cavalry, who traditionally fought as the empire's mailed horsemen, Tatar allies from the Crimea, and artillery units with heavy siege guns. For more than 2 months, Ottoman engineers dug trenches, built gun batteries, and tunneled under bastions. By early September, they had mined and blown parts of Vienna's walls, and the city's garrison was down to about 5,000 effective defenders. Food was scarce, disease was spreading, and morale inside the walls was near collapse. That morning, Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman Grand Vizier, pushed forward with more of the same. His troops worked on saps and mines, hammering bastions like the Burg Bastion and earthworks around the Turkenschanz. Gun crews fired constantly, hoping to widen breaches. Patrols and light cavalry scouted the surrounding country, though fewer than usual, because many men had been pulled away to guard the long supply line stretching back through Hungary and the Balkans. Around midday, the battle shifted. The Christian relief force had arrived by moving through the Vienna woods, staying hidden in the ridges west of the city until the last possible moment. Their artillery and infantry started pressing the Ottoman positions on the plain. Places like Gersthof and the outlying siege lines became scenes of hard fighting. Bavarian and Saxon troops stormed redoubts, while Austrian guns answered Ottoman cannon. The point wasn't to win the battle yet. It was to pin the Ottomans, force them to commit men, and stop them from redeploying once the real blow came. For hours, the two sides traded fire and close combat. Reports from the day talk about musket duels, skirmishes in hedgerows, and artillery thundering across the valley. The Ottomans fought hard, but their attention was still split. Some men manned siege trenches facing Vienna. Others struggled to hold back the coalition pressing from the west. Kara Mustafa still thought he could hold his ground, unaware of what Sobieski had planned. By late afternoon, Sobieski was ready. He had coordinated with the imperial commanders to hold the enemy in place while he assembled one of the largest cavalry strikes in European history. On the ridges of the Kahlenberg and Leopoldsburg, thousands of horsemen massed. Around 6 p.m., the order went out. Roughly 18,000 cavalry surged downhill, Polish winged hussars in the lead, backed by Austrian cuirassiers and German horses. To picture it, think of an entire modern football stadium emptied out, every man on horseback, packed with lances, sabers, and armor, pouring down a slope at full gallop. The sound was described as thunder rolling across the valley. Several factors made this charge devastating. First, the terrain. Charging downhill gave the horses extra speed and the lances extra impact. Second, the Ottomans were stretched thin. Many of their best troops were still tied up in trenches and siege works, not formed in tight battle lines. Third, the timing was perfect. The coalition infantry had been fighting all day, keeping Ottoman formations busy, so when the cavalry came, it hit units that were already tired and distracted. And finally, the Polish winged hussars were no ordinary cavalry. These were shock troops, heavily armed, mounted on powerful horses and trained to break through enemy lines. Their famous feathered wings may have been partly symbolic, but the men behind them were hardened veterans. The effect was chaos. The charge didn't just crash into soldiers. It went straight for the weak points, the Ottoman camp, the baggage train, and even Kara Mustafa's command tents. That tore communications apart and sent panic racing through the army. Artillery crews abandoned their guns, animals stampeded, and wagons clogged escape routes. Units still engaged with the coalition infantry looked over their shoulders, saw their camp in flames, and began to break. Kara Mustafa tried to rally men, but soon he was fleeing with his staff. Within hours, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. The Battle of Vienna ended with staggering losses for the Ottomans. Tens of thousands killed or captured, their vast camp overrun, and morale shattered. By contrast, the coalition, though fighting uphill and unleashing the largest cavalry charge in European history, suffered only a few thousand casualties. The imbalance shows how a perfectly timed shock could collapse even a massive army. Kara Mustafa Pasha, blamed for the disaster, was executed by strangulation with a silk cord. Vienna was saved, and Europe breathed easier. But did this battle truly destroy the Ottomans, or did it simply mark the beginning of their long decline? Many see it as the high water mark of Ottoman expansion, a turning point when momentum shifted toward Europe. Its legacy lives on, in the myth of the Polish winged hussars, in propaganda and legends, in the symbolism of Christianity saved. Yet deeper questions remain. Was this victory about faith, politics, luck, or strategy? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.